Hello and welcome to today's episode of Inside the Factory Labor, Law and Resistance in India. I'm your host, Sai Swajit, and with me are five brilliant guests who will help unpack one of the most powerful and disturbing documentaries on labor conflict in contemporary India. We're talking about The Factory, directed by Rahul Roy. The film follows the aftermath of a violent clash at the Maruti Suzuki plant in Manesar, Gurgaon in 2012. 147 workers were arrested and charged with the murder of a manager. But the documentary doesn't focus on just the incident. It examines what it means to be a worker in modern India, criminalized for organizing and abandoning by both law and society. So, this case itself is a flashpoint for labor rights in India. Now, the film gives us rare access to jailed workers and their family, raising uncomfortable questions about corporate power, legal inequality, and the cost of demanding dignity at work. In this episode, we'll explore some major themes in greater detail. The themes are: what is the nexus of the state and capital as portrayed in the film? The importance of dignity of workers in the workplace, the question of minimum wages, the retrospective application of the new labor laws as opposed to the old ones which were in existence at the time of the Maruti Suzuki plant incident, and the broader constitutional issue or constitutional question of the right to strike as a fundamental right of every citizen and worker in the country. Now I throw the ball to the guests. The floor is open.
Yeah, I think it was a really powerful documentary. It really provided us a detailed look at the workers' struggle to form a union, subsequent legal battles that followed, and just the broader issues of labor rights and justice in India. I think one of the most interesting observations that I had was that the whole film, it's a 2 hour film, quite long at first, but the whole film is shot through the perspective of labor workers and the people involved in legal battles in India. Maruti Suzuki denied any sort of cooperation or involvement with this documentary, which in itself is tells you a narrative which is not pretty at first because not only did they refuse to cooperate, at the same time, when all these legal and subsequent battles were taking place, they were well cognizant of everything that was taking place beneath the scenes and was still ignorant of the fact and all the struggles that the workers were facing. So, yeah, I think that was a pretty interesting sight to see.
Right. So while I went to the documentary, I think one of the key themes that really struck out to me, that is in light of the Industrial Disputes Act, I think the act primarily really fails to imagine the depth that a nexus can be formed and utilized between capital and the state forces to crush any sort of emancipation of the workers and any form of, say, dispute resolution through the official state mechanisms. Uh, and it's really tragic, really, because even the new acts, when I think we'll progress to that part of the discussion, really ignore that and actually push the workers down to a greater degree. I think we can begin our discussions by talking about this particular issue in greater detail. What do you guys think?
Yeah. So I agree, Ankit. But before we move on to discussing the relationship between the capital and the state and how it affects labor rights, I would also like to share my take on the movie and why I thought that as a law student who's studying labor law, a person should definitely watch the film because when we study law, it often tries to locate the dispute elsewhere.
Hmm.
But this movie shows how labor who are subjects of this law, Industrial Dispute Act, how they have to struggle and what their lives are like when the law is not on their side. So so that gives you more understanding on how laws actually play out in the open world. And now coming back to the relationship between, yeah, Sarthak, do you want to say something?
Yeah, adding on to your point, I also want to explain how I felt as to how actually the act is usually dealt with as compared to what it ought to be. For example, the Constitution of India guarantees the right to form associations or unions. But as we saw in the movie, workers attempted to form an independent union, which was repeatedly blocked by the Maruti management. So such incidents show us actually as to what the law ought to be and how it actually is in the real world. the stark contrast. So now continuing on to the next as we had planned.
Yeah, and I'll add a point. I think it's an amalgamation of both the state and the MNCs also, because when an MNC and a state collaborate together against what we saw in the documentary, it's a very powerful documentary. And as Amaya said, every law student, and especially who's studying labor law, should watch this movie. So what I want to say is that it's the amalgamation of both the state and the MNC showed how. A trade union cannot be formed just because how a large MNC is forcing them to not form a trade union at the initial stage, and when they're trying to form it, they eventually like dealt with multiple lockouts and layoffs, which are arbitrary and which we'll discuss later.
Actually,
Yeah,
adding
yeah.
on to what Aryan said, just a brief point. Just on this point, there's a nexus between state and the private corporations. A very interesting point that was made in the movie was that a special prosecutor was appointed. Now, while we do not need to delve into the fact that a special prosecutor was invited and the legalities of that, what's interesting to me is the fact that the special prosecutor was paid a large sum of money, and usually trials
He
are.
was paid, sorry to interrupt, he was paid 11.7 lakhs per day,
Per
like
day.
for
Yeah,
per
I
Yeah,
day,
think
nahin,
some
per
also
day.
it says
totaled
in
to
the
35
around
movie,
crores,
and it's
something
like one of
like
one of like the great legal stalwarts in India is still practicing criminal law.
yeah.
Yeah, so
And what
yeah,
was interesting to me is the fact that usually a special public prosecutor of the court is supposed to act as a minister of justice, right? But here in this case, he was acting as an agent of the government, which completely goes beyond all constitutional principles established. And since the beginning of the case battle, a picture was painted by the prosecutor themselves, who was coming in front of media and telling them and calling all these people majdoos. And a narrative was drawn from the very beginning without even going to the court proceedings or without even talking about the legal rights. So it was just interesting to see that there was, like Aryan pointed out, an amalgamation between the state and MNCs.
Right. And this, really also reflects on the actual state of the workers in the factories. Because when you have a mechanism that is marred by the nexus between capital and the state, you essentially have capital doing whatever they want with the workers in their factories too. Because in the film itself, what Rahul Roy actually covered really well is how brutal the Maruti management was with their employees, and how high their expectations were in terms of productivity, and the unconventional and largely speaking inhumane punishment mechanisms that they had for their own workers in the factories. So do you guys want to reflect on some particular punishments and how poor factory
Yeah,
conditions can get for workers in India?
yeah,
I, yeah, continue.
one of the points which I remember, one of the scenes which I remember while discussing, while watching the documentary, and wherein the one of the worker, the terminated worker was telling, when if you get late to the work, you were asked to stand for multiple minutes and all for like half an hour, and then you were made like multiple like derogatory punishments. You were
Yeah.
supposed to, they were used to make you a cock in
Yeah.
front of everyone. So yeah.
which is
yeah,
which
So
is very interesting, because this punishment that this body folding punishment wherein you're supposed to stand like a cock or a hen is used in public schooling in India to discipline kids. This also shows
hmm,
how employers look at their employees from a vantage point of power. That they have the authority to discipline them, to teach them, like a teacher or an elder in a household would to a kid.
yeah. The
Uh,
point that you made just now, Ankit, reminded me of this one other scene that was right in the beginning. Now, this guy, he says that when I initially joined the workforce, I thought that these people are more educated than me, and maybe they can tell me what to do and how to work. And I didn't see it as exploitation. Maybe they are just teaching me how to,
yeah.
you know, become more efficient. But then after a point of time, I realized they're just exploiting me, and I also have certain rights, and I can talk to other people who are working, and we can together, fight them. So that is also something interesting, how workers, when they join an industry, they form a sort of a collective consciousness sort of a thing, where they all realize what is being done to them, and yet they are helpless to do anything against them. So like that is also another interesting point. That
One last point
I
before we move on.
yeah.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, so in the documentary, we've also shown how about 2,500 workers or so, the number may be wrong, were dismissed after the incident. And the main point that was raised was that a due inquiry was not conducted for any one of them. This highlights two principal violations, which I could deduct. First, principles of natural justice, not giving them a due process, not giving them a due inquiry before hearing them and throwing them off, was something that was violated. And second, if we go through our course manual, we read the Industrial Disputes Act. Now, Section 25F of the Act specifically lays down procedures for retrenchment and how you're supposed to follow a due process of law before you're throwing your worker away without any due compensation or any security. So yeah, we can now move on to the next topic.
Wait. I wanted to put across the point of regarding the daily routine of the workers.
Yeah.
For example, the high production targets that they had. For example, 50 every car 50 per 50 seconds, and insufficient break times. For example, that 7 minute for tea, 30 minutes for lunch, etc., etc. Actually, tell us about the condition of workers that were there. So yeah, let's move on ahead now.
Thank you, everyone, for those wonderful points. I think it's been established so far in our discussions that the film itself was a very powerful representation of what it means to have an MNC running with the authority of the state, and especially when employers treat workers with a holier than thou attitude. And we've explored that within the nexus between the state and the capital that was portrayed in the film. Now, I want to move the conversation towards the portrayal and the broader picture of the question of wages and contract labor versus permanent labor, as was portrayed in the film also, I think, which is a very larger question. Any opening thoughts?
Yeah, I'll put it across not in a derogatory way, but all the contract laborers, as of what we saw in the documentary, they are treated like the middle child of the family. So basically, no one cares about them. You can, that's what we have understood by seeing the documentary, and that's how the legislation has been. There's not a proper legal formalized system for contract workers, and what I think is what I stated, like it's the middle child. So what's the MNC thing? They can throw them off as they did in the documentary, and that's what, and I'll build further upon that.
But that's a
I think
strategic choice, right? That they are being made the middle child by these MNCs and deliberately ignored by the state, so that um, foreign capital that invests in India due to cheap labor, the incentives of cheap labor, can further on exploit the cheap labor and maximize their profits, right?
I think one interesting thing that I found in the movie was just building on this point was that there's a specific distinction that is made between contract laborers are often called dihadi wale, and then normal workers are called mazdoors. There was this one guy who, in his interview, drew a parallel between Maruti Suzuki and Honda. Now, in Honda showroom, the laborers aren't called dihadi wale or mazdoor; they're called employees. Now, when you give them the term employees, you afford them certain sort of command and respect which is not afforded to the contractual labors. And I think our industrial codes are also missing on this very definition of what distinguishes between workers and employees in that
Just
sense.
adding
Yeah.
on to that, in the broader question, even in the film, there was a depiction of contract laborers and permanent laborers. So, and very when this Maruti Suzuki, the issue came to light and gained attention, Suzuki very categorically said that this issue is nothing but a class issue, which I think is very reflective upon the larger Indian mindset we have about laborers in India, that they can't be afforded rights, that there is no distinction between contract laborers and permanent laborers, where both of them are doing the same work, even though contract laborers are being paid less for the same work. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I also I think I'm talking about the same interview as Nakul is. So that same person, he also mentions how this is a strategy that they employ, conscious decision that they make, so as to segregate the laborers, like the laborers or the workers basically, so as to segregate them into smaller groups so that they can in no way form cohesive unions that work together. So they'll do that by employing techniques such as asking them to wear different colors of uniforms.
Hmm.
Like permanent workers can wear white shirts, whereas contract may be blue, something like that. And then there'll be like subsidiary companies, like they said Krishna Maruti, like they made the tires. They're the subsidiary company. They have nothing to do with you. Don't you can't interact with them. So all these things, these distinctions are basically just to sort of break the unity of the labor union or potential labor union, is, if I may. Yeah. So
Right.
if
So
anyone,
as you saying, Ameya, this is a very interesting point because we eventually also have to discuss the differences between the new labor codes and the old ones. And it's interesting that you brought up this point about how employers use certain tactics to essentially reduce the chances of labor unionization. And that's something the new labor laws really allow them to play with, because I think the new labor laws allow for union formation, effective union formation, to only be possible when 50% or more people from the workforce are part of a union. The ones that you mentioned or highlighted essentially stop unions from being unions in the first place and having any bargaining power. So, how do you see these new labor laws actually helping laborers in the first place at all?
Just adding on to Ankit's question, I think this was a perfect point to segue into the distinction between the old labor codes and the new labor codes. Another question I just want to add to all of you is that where do you see if the 2020 codes were in action or were in play during the during this 2012 period, whether whether the workers at the Maruti Suzuki plant in Manesar would be benefited from the new codes, which are supposed to be for the betterment of the laborers, or would they be rather detrimentally affected? What are your guys' views in addition to what Ankit just asked?
I think definitely they would not have worked in the favor of the workers. Two for primary reasons because of why I say this. First, I believe that the process for conducting a strike has become really convoluted, wherein you'll have to send a 14-day notice before initiating a strike, and that notice will also lead you to a conciliation process, if I'm not wrong, which would also be another time-consuming and convoluted process. Furthermore, I think they also, since many of the Maruti workers were on contract, the new labor codes still do not adequately protect contractual or temporary workers from mass termination, because I believe they have increased the threshold or limit from 100 to 300. So in essence, I really do not believe that the new codes would have in any way helped the workers in the Maruti incident.
I also think that what Nakul just said. I also think that this comes in the backdrop of the fact that uh, there have been judicial pronouncements that have not that have specifically and categorically mentioned that the right to strike is not a fundamental right. So I think they are trying to cement that and say that, okay, if it's not a fundamental right, then we can restrict it as much as we want, and that's essentially what they're doing. So also I just want to know your thoughts on this, everyone. So what do you think? Do you think the right to strike should be a fundamental right?
So I feel that the right to strike should be a fundamental right. In the new code that has been launched right now, it has reduced the right to strike, to a very substantial level. Not technically, but it has bureaucratized the same into irrelevance. The strikes have become expensive now because of the time consuming and ineffectiveness that Nakul mentioned about the 14-day period. So essentially, I believe that the new code would not be that helpful
But why
if
do you think that
we
strike
would,
should be a fundamental right?
because they are inherent to the very nature of the labor code, first of all. And secondly,
I have a very simple answer to what Ameya mentioned.
Yeah.
Legal and technical answer. The International Labour Organization tells you that the right to associate and right to strike is one of the fundamental aspect of labor unions. And I get that the International Labour Organization standards a soft law. We are not directly bound by them. But the Supreme Court in National Textile Workers Union versus P.R. Ramakrishna has expressly acknowledged that these instruments, such as international labor law or standards, have a persuasive value when we're interpreting the Constitution. So when we do interpret this question of whether they are fundamental rights, I think these labor law codes and standards can have some persuasive value.
Thank you for answering that question, Nakul. due to a lack of time, we can move on to our concluding thoughts about what we really felt about the message of the film. I think we can begin with Sarthak and work our way around.
So I believe that the factory is not just a documentary. It is a legal case study on the failure of industrial justice in modern India. It reveals the consequences of ignoring labor rights, the criminalization of dissent, and the urgent need for laws in today's time that protect both the body and the dignity of the worker. Now, continuing to you all to elaborate further on what your concluding thoughts regarding this documentary were.
I think it's a great piece, really. It showcases a lot of on-ground realities about labor work in modern-day Indian factories, and it also contextualizes the strides that the new labor codes should have made but haven't. And I think we've gone over them in brief as well. I think most people working in policy and law should watch it and take their learnings from it as well. What about you guys?
Yeah, I think in terms of the Indian labor and constitutional jurisprudence, it's a really compelling piece that also contributes to the already compelling discourse. And yeah, we sure get a chance to watch this whenever we can.
Yeah, and like after discussing about the whole piece and like about discussing about the contract labor and all, so like that's a very important topic that needs to be discussed, like even in the contemporary world as well, because nowadays earlier labor used to get employed contractually. Now even like profession which holds like higher dignity and all are also getting employed through contracts. Like we can take the example of a very prestigious university, Delhi University. Professors are getting employed through contracts. So like it's the same situation over there as well, and there are multiple protests regarding the same. So yeah.
So finally, my concluding remarks are that so basically, through in a strike, there's a fire and one person tragically dies, and all of the labels, 147 of them are charged with section 302, that is murder, and 13 of them get convicted and are sentenced to life imprisonment. Now that rarely ever happens to a crowd. I think that is only because of the money and the size of capital that went into this litigation that they got something on their plate, because 120 people were acquitted, and out of them only 60 people got bail in 2015, that is 3 or 4 years from when the incident occurred, and the others didn't get bail till the till the proceedings ended. So around 60 people just had to waste 5-6 years of their life. This is how labor essentially are treated in India. It is a sad thing that dignity of professions is a thing, and I think
Mhm.
every work should be respected. And yeah, those are my conclusions. Sai,
Thank
if
you,
you
everyone, for your time, and thank you, everyone, for your valuable insights. I think this is a very good point to call it a wrap. One key takeaway for all our viewers is that labor law in India right now is has a ways to go, and I think it is the duty of every policy, as Nakul and Ankit very rightly said, it is a duty of every policymaker, every law student to have a watch and put forward what their thoughts are on this film. See you guys next week. Thank you again for your time, and thank you for joining us today.